All right. What's up, Gromies? Welcome to AROYA Office Hours, your source for free cannabis cultivation education. I'm your moderator, Kaisha, and this is episode 88. If you're on the Hangout or checking us out live on YouTube or Instagram, drop your question in the chat. And if it gets picked, we'll cover it during the show. What's up, Seth and Jason? How you guys doing today?
Well, yeah, pretty good.
Good. All right, let's get into it. We got this question in from Ilya. They wrote, "Hey gang, got the AROYA Go set up a couple weeks ago, blowing my mind with all the stuff I'm learning. I'm in 1 gallon Quar Grow Coco with 0.3 gallon per hour drippers. And as I'm trying to get to full saturation in all bags, I'm noticing that some go up to 70% field capacity and others only 60, no matter how many shots I give them. Could it be a sensor placement issue, or is it normal for compressed cocoa to have such a big variance in max volumetric water content?"
So, I mean, it sounds like you've got a pretty decent setup. Love your dripper rate. Glad to see you using AROYA Go to monitor this, and you're asking the right questions. So, I would say don't get too concerned about it. 10% difference, across the board. It's not a huge impact. Usually for that type of courier, we see that field capacity right at 65%. So you got a few that are hanging above, a few that are hanging below. Really glad you're also paying attention to sensor installation. So when you think about the important things there, obviously the height from the bottom of the bag is going to be important. So use your installation template tool, and then and making sure that sensor is flush into the media. Any air that is around those prongs is going to cause some amount of error in the water content reading that you're seeing. And then just because the consistency and nature, the natural product of core air, you can see that variation as well. So, if that prong, hits a hard chunky piece of core air when it's going in and compacts it, that could cause an air pocket or a water pocket, any of those types of things. So, at a plus or minus 5% water content and field capacity, I probably wouldn't spend too much time. You're still going to be getting extremely good data that's powerful enough to make good decisions on.
Yeah, I mean, we look at thousands and thousands of blocks worth of cocoa data, and I would say that's highly expected. Even when we see a big commercial installation put in, let's say, 2,000 plants in a room, once we blow it up to that scale, we definitely see inconsistencies in the cocoa. And an important thing to remember is, it's a byproduct from another industry that's just come into horticulture in the last 15 years or so. And in order for someone to shuck that coconut, process that husk, and get you a compressed block for a couple dollars while they're, producing these coconuts in India or Sri Lanka, there's an associated tolerance we accept. If we wanted every block to be absolutely uniform, you'd be paying a lot more for your cocoa. And, back to what Jason said, best practice for your sensor installation is critical. So if you're having any inconsistency when you push it in, just as Jason mentioned, a hard chunk in there, that happens quite often where we get a chunk of husk that hasn't been ground too well. And if you're feeling, some excessive resistance part of the way through the installation of the sensor, it might be a good idea to move it to the other side of the pot. And then also, some of these bags after hydration, we kind of see some inconsistent packing. So one of the things, depending on manufacturer that you can look at is, Dutch planting, for instance, is always recommended. You hydrate the pots and don't get in there with your hands and stir it up. You want to keep as much consistency across that media as possible. So any variation you can introduce is going to affect that. And it's important to remember too, these plants, even though your pots might not be hitting the exact same field capacity, your plants aren't going to be the exact same size either. Even in a perfectly run system, these are biological units. We see variation. It's dynamic. So as your plants grow, even if you started with a perfectly uniform substrate across your plant population, we see those lines start to change. And there's a few things that can influence that, in cocoa, for instance, in a 1 gallon pot, if you're running a bigger plant, we usually expect to see that field capacity go down later in the run, just as your plant's really packing that pot out with roots and filling that pore space that would normally be occupied by water. So there's a few things to keep in mind there. And then as, back to what I was saying, as your plants grow, we're looking at, average trends here. If we've got, even on a micro scale, let's say 16 plants on one irrigation zone, that's the biggest granularity of control we have. So if all my plants in there are running within 10% of each other, I'm just going to keep in mind that, hey, I need to adjust my set points on what I consider, actions for irrigation to reflect that thought that like, hey, my sensor's plugged into the most average plant. I should expect that if I did nail the most average plant size, some of my plants are going to be a little bigger, taking up more water. Some are going to be a little smaller, taking up less water. And I need to plan everything within a set of ranges, not necessarily focus on a critical point unless I'm setting that critical point as an average point with which I need to react to.
Yeah. And, we've encountered this quite a bit as people start to learn to use time series data in the substrate specifically. And really a lot of what it comes down to is kind of mentally thinking about, hey, how is these numbers changing over time, right? So, if, let's say you've got 3 sensors in or 5 sensors in, are you seeing the drybacks all at say 15% or 20%? Or are you seeing a big variation in that delta number as well? So kind of start thinking, all right, well, rather than making sure right now my numbers are exactly matching because, well, not only is there differences among those plants and the substrates, you're just always going to have some amount of variation in what those exact numbers are. And that's not nearly as important as how is that number changing on a photo period basis.
Yeah, absolutely. And then if we expand to, if we're talking about dryback numbers, for instance, if you increase your pot size, but not your plant size, you're not going to have as much of a dryback. So really, when you first start using this, the best thing you can do is make sure your sensor installation is good and just log that data for a while and look back. You can start crop steering aggressively. A lot of growers we've always been crop steering through irrigation, whether we're in a big pot watering once a day or once every other day, or in a small pot irrigating 8 times a day all the way through. So start, use it as a learning tool more than anything right off the bat and start to get used to what those numbers actually mean. One of my biggest things I tell people is right away, hey, now that you've got this, and for years you've probably been picking up your pots, adjusting your hand feel to what the best scale you had available, right? The best tools that you had access to. Now it might be time to go in and start resetting some of those intuitive measurements to match the new scale you're working with, so you can easily keep track of like, hey, here's what this 25% dry bag means on a block that's hitting 75%. Here's what it means on a block that's hitting 65, 60. And in the end, understanding that dry bag value has a lot more to do with how vigorously your plant's growing and transpiring than it does an absolute value that we're always looking for.
You guys, thank you so much for that. Yeah, it's all about those averages, right? Ilya, we appreciate your question. Good luck with the AROYA Go. Keep us posted on how you're doing out there. Moving on to some live questions we got here from Instagram. It's me, wrote in. They write, first time crop steering on day 6 of flower and generative steering. Any advice?
Keep generative steering for a while.
Yeah. Start measuring your plants. Keep generative steering until you top out that stretch and can demonstrate it through your measurements. Hey, daily, this has been slowing down to the point where it's, we're less than an inch or less than half an inch a day, and start working it that way. Keep running generative, and also be patient and look at the media you're working with and understand where you need to start drawing those dryback lines. If we're in coco, 20 to 25% is usually the bottom of where we want to dry back to. Rock wool, early on, we don't want to go down below that 40% line.
Yeah, and I mean, as always, kind of goes without saying, do your best to document things on a daily basis. Document what you're doing, document what your plants are doing, document their responses to the strategies that you're applying in there. So always think about, crop registration as part of your grow cycle. Obviously, these plants are typically going to grow almost regardless of what the conditions are within some pretty wide parameter because they're so tolerant. But in order to really get the best out of that crop, we got to start hitting a narrow window of environmental and substrate factors. So make sure you're taking runoff numbers. Make sure you're attributing plant heights. Node spacing is a great one to see if your generative crop steering is successful in how that plant morphology ends up. And obviously, if you don't have any good systems to do it, get it in a notebook, start taking pictures with your phone. I always encourage, start doing that in a digital manner, get into a G drive so that you can start graphing those numbers and you can save those photos digitally. Maybe it gives you a good option to start sharing them and get better advice from other growers in the community.
Yeah. On that point, a picture's worth 1,000 words. And if you don't store it in the right place, I couldn't tell you how many pictures in my phone show some weird plants, but I've got nothing more than a date and time stamp on it. if I had been wise enough at the time to organize those into folders or files that, classified each grow, and then I put in the rest of my notes, those pictures would actually mean something because I could reference what else was going on. Whereas if I'm not attributing that to anything or organizing it right, I might look at that picture and go, oh man, this is going to take me 20 minutes to dig up where that picture even came from or when.
Reminds me of hours and hours of renaming pictures that I had taken, with the strain name and a date, and not always some note of what I was trying to capture there. But usually, the more that you can get in there to attribute it, that metadata can really help make sense of the big puzzle.
Yeah, and if you even if you don't have a great history of note taking, if you do have some photos and notes, taking the time to try to organize those and then continuing to do that more intensely can also help you compare to a baseline of, how you were growing before. Picture's worth 1,000 words. If you've been running the same strain 10 times and you've got, 3 pictures from each run in the past, maybe try to figure out what day you took those pictures and start setting some landmark KPIs for your strains and say, hey, here's what it looked at day 21 before. Here's what it looks at day 21 now. What should I be expecting? What's good? What's bad? And then go from there.
Yeah, we're big fans of crop registration out here. Check out last week's episode. We did a really good overview on it. And actually, speaking of last week's episode, that was episode 88. You are not experiencing deja vu. I accidentally said that this is episode 88, but we're in episode 89. So anyway, moving on. We got this comment actually on YouTube, Instagram. Someone wrote, I'm having major dropout late in bud with crop steering. What do you guys think?
Nutrient dropout?
I don't know.
Plants wilting?
We might have to, okay, so maybe
let's look at a few options of what that might mean.
Okay.
I guess.
Yeah.
If we're looking at plants wilting, a pretty common thing we'll see is trying to run too generative late, which means typically for a lot of people, your plant is a lot bigger than your media proportionally it should be. And you're hitting a point where you can't actually run generative. So one thing we see is people going to try to ripen pretty hard. And by doing that, they're pushing that dryback line all the way down into a temporary wilting point with coco. And then with rock wool, sometimes even down to that permanent wilting point. So that's one thing to be aware of. There's a definite bottom on how far you want to dry back. And then also, if we're not pushing enough runoff, we could be looking at some EC and pH issues depending on the strain and exactly how much you've built up in that pot and what the actual composition of those nutrients is. So that's just one thing. If they want to clarify what dropout is, I'd love to hear there.
Yes. So we may have addressed one dropout issue, but if you have another one, please post it in the chat so we can talk about it. Awesome. All right. We got this question just dropped on Instagram, PNW Farmer. They write, after I'm done mixing my feed, it's 3.1 EC, pH 6.4. Should I use a lot of pH down or leave it as is? 105 gallon tank.
So, it's going to depend on your media a little bit. If you were in soil, that might be a good place to be at that 6.4. When we're talking about coco, usually I like to be closer to say 5.8, 5.9. And for rock wool, usually like to be around 5.6. So there's a good chance. If you're using one of the more commercially popular medias like rock wool or coco, you're going to benefit significantly by getting that pH down in there and being in a more optimal range.
Oh, absolutely. If we're not mixing any lime, calcium carbonate, or azomite, any kind of buffering mineral like that gives us some pH stability in the root zone, it's important to remember that although there is a pot and it looks like it's dirt, or in the case of rock wool, maybe a chunk of insulation, we don't have any pH control. That plant, part of the reason we're doing that is we have full control over that nutrient solution going into the plant, and we can count on it not reacting in an uncontrolled way inside the media. So that pH is very important. In a 105 gallon tank, you're probably not going to use a lot to bring it down from 6.4. In fact, if you're post salt mixing at 6.4, that's actually a pretty good spot to be. I know, like around where we live, if you're on well water in certain areas, for instance, your pH of your groundwater might come out at 8.2, 8.4. And in that case, I might actually be using a lot of pH down to get it from a 7.1 or 7.2 all the way down to that 5.8, 5.9. So 6.4, not bad. And then, one of the cool things about that, most of your pH down products on the market, or some of the better ones, are phosphoric acid. So you're actually adding a little bit of plant nutrition when you do that. The only time it can be an issue is if you are trying to temper water that's, let's say, 8+. Now you're introducing such a large proportion of phosphoric acid that it might actually be affecting your NPK ratio a little bit. And that's why a lot of farms and places will run an RO system or other water filtration, just to get rid of the things that they don't want to have be a variable in how they mix their fertilizer solution.
Yeah, and also keep in mind that different pH downs are going to require different amounts of pH down in order to achieve that amount. So, phosphoric acid, like Seth said, that's actually one of the more effective ones. Something like citric acid or sulfuric acid is going to be the less effective, where you have to add more. I think one of the most potent ones that I'm familiar with is the nitric acid pH down. So yeah, make sure that you're taking a look at what you're using. And don't be afraid to change pH down if you need to.
Yeah, and be aware out on the market too, there are a range of dilution rates that these they're all acids. They come in various options, but most manufacturers will have a little bit different dilution rate. If we're looking at, say, phosphoric or nitric acid, we've got 4 different manufacturers. This is just round numbers I'm talking about. They're all selling the same product, right? So one of their ways to differentiate themselves is say, hey, we're at a 38%, a 45% concentration. Hey, we're at a 50%. We're the strongest on the market. So paying attention to that is pretty important, and that's going to affect how much you have to put in. Usually, old school method, like a 105-gallon tank, go slow, be patient, and as always, take notes. If you have a particular mix that you're putting in, like let's say you're 3.1, pay attention. If you notate how many milliliters of pH down you put in, post mix, you can start to replicate that every time. And then it's not a stand there, put in a few drops, mix and wait and test. Now you can nail it every time, provided your incoming water is the same.
Yeah, I remember many a times where it's like, all right, let's get some pH down in here, and then you watch it rise back up as it gets mixed into dilution. So,
oh, absolutely. And particularly if you have like fairly hard high pH water, I've had a lot of luck in the past when I am dealing with high pH water input. Once I figure out how much pH down I'm going to need post salt mixing, I'll actually put about half of that, or maybe even the whole dose in before, let that mixture homogenize, and then add my salts, because I don't get as much fallout mixing in the mid 5 range versus mixing up at, like, let's say 7+.
Yep. And I mean, that's just going to depend on what type of mixing equipment you have. Obviously, if you're in a dosatron situation, that might not be the easiest solution.
Absolutely. They did mention 105-gallon tank, though, so I think they're hand mixing. The best you can do is take notes. And like I said, really understand that water quality has a lot to do with how you're going to approach this, and realize that that amount is going to be maybe not necessarily totally unique, but you can't compare those amounts of pH down to what other people are doing necessarily. You've got to establish how much you need in your specific application with those specific products. And when you switch from something with, say, a 45 to 50% concentration, those are 2 easy ones I can think of off the market, you're going to have to get used to adding a little less if you switched up to the 50, or a little more if you switched down to the 45.
Amazing, you guys. Thank you so much. PNW Farmer, good luck. Let us know if you have any other questions. All right, on the subject of nutrients, I got this question in from Cesar. They write, how often should I feed nutrients in cocoa? I'm currently using Athena Proline at 3.0 EC, but I noticed my runoff EC was in the double digits, which caused my media pH to spike down, which caused many plants to not fully develop. What do you guys think?
I mean, I'd break this down a little bit. Usually when I see EC levels a little bit high, it typically is not going to affect your pH level significantly, unless you've run into an imbalance in there, in which you're going to want to analyze some other things that are going on in there. As far as feed EC at 3.0, Athena in this case, fertigating on a daily basis in cocoa, that's pretty regular for a fairly stable fertigation regimen. So you might check out some other impacts that are going on in there.
I mean, give the token advice here. Get some root zone monitoring so we can see what's actually going on inside your root zone. All we know is that the EC is high, right? But an important thing to think about once you build up to those higher EC levels If you've been maintaining appropriate runoff and replacing your negative ions as they get consumed by the plant or uptaken, we shouldn't see very much pH shift at all because we have a higher concentration of ions. So when we change that balance just a little bit from positive to negative, it's not as impactful as at a lower EC state. If I'm looking at a balance on 2,000 ppm of nutrients in there and I remove 500 of that, that's much more impactful than if I have 8,000 and I remove 500 to the total balance. So going back in time and looking at probably your runoff strategies as you built up, that's a common thing we see is people really wanting to push that high EC, especially under high light, high CO2 situations, the new world of LED growing. A lot of the focus is on getting that EC number up early on. And if we're not giving it appropriate runoff while we're trying to stack that, then over time we can hit that low pH scenario. And at that point, if that's been a persistent problem that's been building over time, then it is much harder to correct. So that's part of why getting your daily runoff readings, reading pH, and then maintaining, my general rule is 5 to 10% of my irrigation volume, I want to be runoff every day. If I'm pushing runoff that day, and if I'm trying to build my EC, I'm going to go no more than 2 or 3 days without runoff. That way I can push some runoff, check my pH, and make sure I'm not pushing that down as I'm trying to stack it up. I think the fundamental thing there is understanding that when we just put the salts in, we have full control over that pH. What we're dealing with is what the plant's doing with that nutrient solution after we introduce it to the media, and then looking at that trend over time in pH.
Love it. Cesar, good luck. If you need some assistance with tracking and monitoring your plants, AROYA knows something about that. So hit us up. All right, YouTube. We got a question from Dr. J related to feeding. They want to know, should I feed till the end or back off on anything the last 2 weeks?
Yeah. So I think we've hit on this one quite a few times. We'll get into it briefly here today. Obviously, there's lots of products from pretty major nutrient suppliers these days that are encouraging a decrease in nitrogen towards the last 10 days, 2 weeks there. So I always like to call that the ripening phase of the grow cycle, just because we've got a lot of different approaches there, but everything's got the same goal, right? Reduce the amount of carbohydrates in there so that we get a little bit cleaner burn. Doing that by reducing some of the nitrogen and implementing more generative types of strategies. And so a lot of times, what I like to talk about is nutrient levels based on whether we are changing our nutrient blend or not. So, if I am changing up my nutrient blend, a lot of times I'll stay at the same pH, the same EC, or drop to maybe 3/4. If I'm not, then a lot of times I'll drop to 1/2 to 3/4 towards the end of the cycle.
Yeah, the big thing to look at there is whether we're actually using a finishing product or we're using a one mix flour solution that, the only way we can control that nitrogen is by actually lowering that feed EC. And then the challenge becomes, right back to root zone monitoring, being able to see when that plant has really started to enter senescence and is not feeding very much anymore. That's one way we can dial like, hey, we're not needing to replace as much ions with our nutrient feed every day to maintain that pH and EC. And as we see that, so over time, this is something that you shouldn't really hammer hard on one run, but rather analyze over time, looking back, and really start to nail when we can either drop that feed EC, or ideally on, certain like more fickle strains, hey, we need to maybe look at a product that allows us to lower that nitrate ratio a little bit earlier because we're seeing a plant that has some sensitivity to it. So it really depends on what line you're running, how complicated you're making your mix. And then really remember that you've spent, at this point, if we're 50 days into the growth cycle, we've spent 50 days acclimatizing this plant to a certain EC level within the root zone. And we always have to maintain pH, even in ripening. We don't want to see that tank out or go too high. So we're kind of just balancing, keeping the plant in a comfortable zone where we're not going to totally lock it out because we're tanking the pH down below 5. And we're not basically changing the EC, the salinity in the root zone too radically. Because again, we spent 2 months building this plant up to tolerate that EC zone. Rapid shifts in that the plant can't really react to. So, when you go back to the old days of the 2-week flush, no nutrients. The problem is we've built up a bunch of EC. The plant's roots have adapted to it. Now we wash away all that EC. Our osmotic differential's reversed. Now there's less ions outside of the root than inside, and it's really hard to get water to go up into the plant. So we really just want to keep the plant comfortable and not torture it and kill it too much by putting it out of health ranges. We're looking at, stressing through irrigation, not the roots essentially.
Yeah, and just a quick clarification on those numbers. I was using it, say 50% or 3/4. I'm talking about in as a percentage of your typical feed strength, right? So if I was feeding it 4 for most of the flower cycle, and then I wanted to be at 75% strength, that would be a 3.0 EC.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic, you guys. Thank you for that. All right. Ian just dropped this question on YouTube. Again, I think we're still on the nutrient topic, but they wrote, how do you guys feel about using PowerSi Bloom and Flower? We're using Athena Pro line with 1 gallon coco. Thanks. Any experience with that?
Yeah. I mean, so PowerSi is a very reputable silica additive on the market. There has been some studies that show it does increase the durability of cell walls. So in application, a lot of times what we see is a little bit better pest resistance.
Yeah, I think what they're talking about a little bit is PowerSi has expanded into selling, base nutrient salts. As far as that goes, I personally have not run them. I've used PowerSi silicate in the past. That was a great product. Most likely, depending on your water quality, you're going to see quite similar results between the two, so long as you operate both of them within ranges that they work. And where that comes in with different manufacturers, and that's one thing to ask if you are talking to a representative from these manufacturers, questions like, what pH do I need to be mixing this fertilizer at? Is it sensitive to high pH, producing a lot of fallout? So I'm going to have trouble with my, I'll keep mixing up a certain amount of nutrient and not getting the EC that I'm after. So that might mean I need to mix that one a little lower pH, and just basically getting familiar with how to operate it. We're pretty fertilizer agnostic. Between those two brands, I doubt you're going to get one that is a bad fertilizer. So for you, it comes down to what brand do you like, what's easier to use in your system, and what's the most cost effective.
Yeah, and kind of as a general rule of thumb, if you are in a commercial facility, it's probably good to do a couple of test runs before you switch over your whole production line.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, if you're operating at a commercial level that can be hugely beneficial is having a test bench in a room that you have the ability to run a different nutrient line on, whether that's a 55-gallon drum in the hall with an air stone that you're hand mixing to basically feed one bench, or a little bit more advanced system. Either way, it's best to do these trials side by side with the same strains in the same room and figure out what the results mean. Because if we protract it over, hey, here's my averages on, I'll just pick it on Athena and PowerSi here, but here's what we get running Athena, and then we just switch a whole room over to PowerSi, that doesn't account for any of the variables that can happen anywhere along the way with the grow. So if I had one round that everything went off perfectly, I was running Athena, and then, hey, we got a different veg manager in, and we had 2 rounds of veg plants that were not healthy. Well, that's not really a fair evaluation of the fertilizer there. So anytime you're evaluating that, eliminate as many variables as possible and make it as much of a side-by-side comparison as you possibly can.
And one of the big challenges that I find when testing out different nutrient manufacturers is that not always am I going to see the exact same results at the same EC from nutrient manufacturer to nutrient manufacturer. So, that's kind of a baseline of where to start. But it's not necessarily going to mean that, hey, when I'm at 3.5 in Athena, I'm optimizing my plants, that when I'm at 3.5 with PowerSi, my plants are going to be optimized as well. So that's kind of a curveball that, a few test runs might give you the chance to learn more about.
Yeah, it's important to remember too, when we're talking about fertilizer, there's only so many plant essential elements out there, aka nutrients, and there's only so many sources of those particular nutrients in terms of the chemistry and how they come in salt form. So when we're looking across manufacturers, we're looking at, production quality, how consistent, smooth, and pure is that particular product, and then what are their various nutrient concentrations within that. So each company is going to have a little bit different formula in terms of how much NPK and then all their micro ratios they're giving. So that's part of what ties into why different ones perform differently at different EC levels.
And then an end user, obviously, accessibility and costs are going to come into play as well. So, it's one of those things that, all right, maybe if I'm using half as an expensive nutrient, but I'm still getting 3/4 of the results, it kind of depends on, what market you're in. If I'm doing bulk and we're doing distillates and extracts, then maybe that's actually a more profitable route to go. So when you're thinking about those, you kind of got to get holistic and compare those results with what your expectations are for that business.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good thing to look at is there's a handful of companies in the past that had very complicated nutrient lines, right? We're talking about 6+ different products that we need to mix in our tank to work. Did those and do they continue to produce great results? Absolutely. But if I have a 8 or 10 part nutrient mix that I need to figure out how to inject in a commercial skid, that's not necessarily practical. And I might actually spend more money making that system work or lose more money when it plugs up or doesn't work right and I start killing plants. So there's, definite operational risks associated with any different thing you do. Anytime you're going to change something, and it's important to evaluate those before you make that jump. And some of them are easier. If I'm going from hand mixing 8 different parts every morning to having 3 dosatrons and a pH meter that just takes care of my batch tank for me, hey, I might have saved a lot of money and maybe I get the same yield, but a little bit lower terp concentration, let's say, or terp quantity. Okay, well, did that make a price premium on my actual end product? And sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes it's no. So that's the whole thing is basically, your grow has to align with your business plan, or your business plan has to align with the style you want to grow in. But if they don't, it's going to be very difficult to be successful in the long run.
That's right, Joe. Trying to make sure we get that return on investment. Perfect. Thank you guys for that. All right. I've gotten a couple of questions in. People are describing their setup and their situation and want to get you guys insight on it. So let me get to those. This first one came from Kenny. He just dropped this on YouTube. He writes, I have a room that's stretched 10 inches in between weeks 4 and 5. Plants usually stop around 40 to 45 inches, but these are almost 60 inches. What would cause this? I haven't changed plant count or veg time. Sounds like a nice problem to have.
Assuming that you are working with the same cultivar, the data within a cultivar here, obviously maybe any changes in fertigation strategies would be probably one of the first ones that I see. There is a chance. I was working with a client recently that where their HPS bulbs were just starting to lose intensity, and that resulted in a different morphological expression from the plant than they had in the past. And so firstly, I would look at fertigation strategies. Did we have any changes in there that would encourage that plant to continue stretching longer in the cycle? Things like light intensity. When we talk about lower light intensities, kind of counterintuitive, but lower light intensities usually make the plant stretch more. And that's because they're doing some apical dominance. They're looking to try and capture as much light as possible. And how do they do that? They get closer to the light.
Yep. Anytime your plants are short on light, they're going to stretch more. One thing to look at, just as Jason said, fertigation strategies. If you have been pulsing those plants harder than you previously have, or switching strategies earlier, that's another common thing we see switching from generative over into vegetative too early, because what we're trying to do is work with the plant's natural cycle. Every strain we work with has a certain amount of time that, it's called determinism in plants. Basically, once we go to 12-12, that plant's on a timed life cycle, right? There's a certain amount of days it wants to die. It wants until it dies. Anything in there is going to be determined by energy inputs on how long that actually takes. But if we're maxing out all of our energy inputs, that lifespan should be about the same every time we grow that strain. Within that strain, we've got a stretch period, a period where it's setting flowers, then a period where it's bulking up the flowers, and then we have our ripening period. So we want to adjust our fertigation strategies to reflect those different growth phases of the plant. So pulsing too hard in certain strains too, especially if you've been growing them for years with a pretty conservative strategy and now you're rolling over into trying to crop steer them harder and produce more yield, there's certainly I don't want to say huge, but a reasonably large subset of strains that do not respond to hard bulking signals or some of the more high nitrate fertilizers in the way that we want. Those signals tend to push them to continue to stretch. And, that's kind of a sign that sometimes, hey, we need to evaluate, was our irrigation strategy on point for this run? And then holistically, were our lights bright enough? Did we have enough CO2? Did we have enough inputs on this run compared to the others to match the performance? But overwhelmingly, we have seen a lot of, especially as, HPS bulbs become more expensive, harder to find recently. A big problem with people run in, in a commercial facility or even a non-commercial facility, your bulbs don't all pop at once. So a few years into operation, a lot of times you've kind of got this checkerboard pattern or rough checkerboard of some lights that are brand new, some that are 3 months old, some that are a year and a half old. A lot of people aren't changing them until they pop, which sounds good financially until you factor in that, hey, year in, we're seeing a lot of these HPS bulbs lose 30% plus of the PPFD they're putting out at canopy level.
Yeah. I was just kind of thinking of trying to get a strategy on there, and maybe you just write the date down on the ballast. So when you change the bulb, it might be a simple thing. Obviously, it's what I do with my oil changes, just trying to keep track of things that you're not thinking of. Just get it right down when you do it.
Yeah. And another great strategy is if you don't already have a PPFD meter of some sort. Number one, it's great to get a fairly accurate one. The biggest thing you're looking for is precision, but map out your room a little bit. Go around there every run at like 3 different points and say, hey, at the canopy, am I getting this PPFD that I know I need? And if I'm not reaching that number, why is it? Sometimes we'll see plants even like, hey, why did my Mac 1 not produce as much? It's not a stretchy plant, but it's like, oh, well, it's shorter than normal this time. And when we double light distance, we actually have it doesn't halve your light energy. You have about a quarter as much. So the farther inches make a difference, I guess, is what I'm getting at when it comes to the amount of light energy hitting your plant. So right back to crop registration, holistic approach, right? Document everything.
Good luck out there, Kenny, with your massive plants. It's tough out there. All right. Lucky Farms wrote in. They wrote, sometimes when I water, I notice I struggle to reach my max water content of 60% with drip irrigation. Many times I'll get to 50 to 54%, but I know it can go higher because when I hand water with the same amount of water, it seems to saturate the media up to 60 to 65% based on the sensor readings. I know channeling could be a possibility, but the pot seemed adequately saturated when using drip irrigation, and I never dry back more than 15 to 30%, depending on which phase of flower. Any thoughts?
Yeah, so basically what I'm hearing is the question is, all right, if when I hand water, I can get a slightly higher field capacity than when we're running on drip. And the question that I would come to is, all right, well, how much runoff we're getting and how fast we get that runoff, right? So you might actually be above field capacity if you're hand watering, and you're going to see some readings up there at say 65%. There's a chance that our substrate is super saturated for a short period of time, and some of those readings are coming through. So that would be my intuition as far as why you could see that.
Yeah, when we're talking drip on any different kind of media, it's important to look at, is it coco, is it rock wool? Is it rock wool that we've over dried at any particular point? Because 30% might be kind of pushing it for most of the run on your rock wool dryback. If it is coco, I think one of the first indicators I'd look for is, am I getting any runoff before I actually hit field capacity in my P1 watering cycle? So if I've got 5 P1s, but I start to notice a little bit of runoff after my third event, and a little, third, fourth, and fifth, I've got runoff, but I'm still seeing my water content going up. That means I'm putting it on too fast. And a certain portion of each irrigation is not reaching the plant. We want to shorten those irrigation durations or spread them out a little more in time until we can see that, hey, we're hitting field capacity without achieving any runoff. And then another distinction is whether or not you're using a, time series data in terms of like automated collection, or are you using something like the Solus and stabbing that pot right after you water? Because if we're leaving a sensor plugged in over time, what we typically see with people, and I think some of the rock wool examples, I wish I had a graph to show you right now, are great. Like, hey, I just went in and hand watered, tried to get these back from 25% up to my 60, 70%. It'll go up, and then 20 minutes later, it's right back down. And that on the graph is what that super saturation Jason was talking about. I'll never do that again. You can slap me. I was thinking of somebody who had this issue, but that's what it looks like. Sometimes that media, it does take time for that water to travel down through the media and actually run off. And then another thing to consider, just like we talked about at the beginning of the episode, when are we looking at this? If we're in coco and you're hitting week 6, 7, that's actually expected if you're growing a healthy plant that's really overtaking that whole media. So it is what it is. Sometimes you're locked into a range you don't expect, but at that point you have to kind of play with that range and work within it.
Appreciate you guys. Thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to move on. We've gotten 2 questions regarding pot size, because as we know, pot size matters. So I'm going to start with this one from Mr. Mary Jane. They wrote in, I'm currently in a 3-gallon Floraflex matrix system pot. I'm only getting a 10 to 13% dry back. Would you recommend downsizing to either a 1 or 2-gallon pots? He's actually looking for a size recommendation.
I'd probably step down to a 2-gallon as your first step, and that'll give you a little bit more flexibility in your crop steering strategies.
Yeah, start down at a 2-gallon for sure. And then also maybe look at are you dropping a clone straight into that 3-gallon pot? If so, you're probably not getting the best root development throughout veg, just because that's a lot of effort for that clone to really overtake that pot. So look at a few strategies. And for reference, if you're in a 3-gallon pot, what would you say, Jason? 9-foot tall plant in a general crop, 9-10 foot tall plant in a general crop steering scenario. For reference, the first time I switched down to like a 1-gallon pot or a 3-liter biochar, we're flipping plants at 36 inches, roughly the same as we were in a 3.5-gallon pot. But now instead of getting, 5 feet tall, those plants were pushing 8.5 feet tall because we had to water them so aggressively just to keep up with their needs. So start with your 2-gallon. And if you're still not getting the control you want, you can go back to a 1-gallon.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up the transplanting thing there, because I've seen it both ways out there. Where we can go right into a coco bag from our clones, and that's obviously going to save us a little bit of time, a little bit of money, and then obviously just less labor overall. And so it really comes down to as how well can you manage that irrigation strategy during your rooting in period. Obviously in a 3-gallon, it's going to be extremely difficult to go from a clone into a 3-gallon, just because you're going to have so much reservoir water in there that we're not going to get a lot of dry back, a lot of activity that we're pushing for when we want those roots to seek out the water in the media. So, when you are going to 2-gallon, if you're still transplanting into a veg cube, hopefully it is a coco coir cube, just because I like to stick with similar types of medias. No big deal if you are in a 4-inch rock wool. Those also transplant pretty well, just a little bit different into a 2-gallon or 3-gallon coco bag. And so obviously I would keep doing that. If you're in a 1-gallon, you want to start getting wild, save some time, save some money. There's a chance that you'll get good results in a 1-gallon, getting the coco or the clone right into the coco 1-gallon.
Yeah, if I was in your position in the 3-gallon, I would go with an intermediate. I know Jason used to grow in 3.5-gallon medias as well, and we're always running a 4-inch intermediate media before we transplanted into the bigger 3-gallon. If I were you, I would look at either rock wool or, just like Jason said, a coco intermediate substrate. That way you're putting in a plant that has a lot more root mass and a lot more transpirational ability to really aggressively root in. And one of the main ways we push that rooting in practice is by successive irrigation. While in the 3-gallon, if you over irrigate that little clone, you're gonna drown it, right? We need to get some oxygen down into that root zone. So I would play around with options. If you are in a space where you're trying to grow the biggest plants possible, which I'm jealous, that would be pretty fun. I think I would probably try to grow them fairly big in veg, transplant them, and by big, 2 feet, 2.5, transplant them, and then give them a week and flip them.
Yeah, I was actually kind of thinking about something that I don't think we've hit too much in the show yet, and that is some of the application differences between plastic bags and mesh bags in a coco. And it's kind of amazing how much difference that can cause in water loss. And really what's going on there is mostly evaporation from the side of these bags with that mesh bag. And so when we think about, all right, maybe I need to be between a 1-gallon and a 2-gallon, but I don't get quite enough water loss in my 2-gallon to get as many irrigations in there as I want. And you might actually just move into a 2-gallon with the mesh sided before you go all the way down to the 1-gallon. And vice versa. Maybe I'm in a 1-gallon, but I have other reasons that I don't want to move up in media size, and you're in a mesh sided. I got to store a little bit more water in there. Let's go with the plastic sided bags.
Yeah, and it's important to remember too. There's a pretty good rooting in difference between mesh and plastic. When I've got a mesh bag and I've got all that air pruning going on at the side of the pot, that's affecting how those roots are actually structured. Doing that, the roots branch off a lot more. We don't have nearly as long of a space, and because those roots have a shorter distance from the root to the stem, or the root tips actually, where the water uptake happens, because water uptake's happening just on the very tips of the roots. I'm building a much more efficient root system that has way more points to uptake that water from. So that's another thing to consider. A lot of times I can get a bigger plant out of a 1-gallon mesh than I can plastic bag, but I'm giving up that steering ability.
That's a great point. Thank you guys for that overview. Okay, here's the second pot size question from Chronic Sosa over on YouTube. They write, is 12 plants in 1 gallon or 9 1-gallon pots best for a 4x4 micro drip setup with a 650 watt HLG Scorpion Diablo with far red? What do you guys think?
Depends on how tall you're flipping them and what strain it is. Those are two of the densities that we find some of the best performance in. A lot of it just comes down to how bushy does that plant get inside of that that particular cultivar, get in that setting. Some are definitely want to grow upright more so they can be crowded a little more. Some want to spread out. And then what's your overall goal? I know if it were me in a 1 light setup with a single 4x4, if that's what you're running, I would probably be running more around that 9 plants a light, just because I'm not going to have to do as much pruning work, and I'm going to get better light penetration and a higher ratio of A to B bud. Obviously, we talk a lot about commercial production here, and reducing pruning, plant touches, that's a big part of it. But another thing we found is for a lot of strains, backing off from 16 down to 12, down to 9, and then adjusting your veg to produce similar biomass results in a much higher product quality and much more consistent bud size farther down in the canopy.
And lower inputs. Anytime that I'm growing less plants, I've got a little bit less labor into cloning, a little bit less labor into media.
Yeah, and then, that's not even counting it, especially if we're talking about a smaller, more micro grow, staying within your plant count, your allowed plant count in whatever state that you're in. I know different states, some you might be able to run 12. Some we might be stuck at 6. And that's a little bit different of a strategy.
Fantastic, you guys. Thank you for that. And thank you for those pot size related questions. That's an important topic. All right. We got this question about the Solus. Grow Plum wrote in, hello, can you keep the Solus in the soil in the same spot for a couple days, or will it hurt the device?
Should be good to go. Any of our commercial systems, they're in there for 2 months at a time. Most hopefully without the sensor really ever moving. Solus is the same exact sensor head, prongs on there as our commercial systems. So in agriculture application, those get left in fields for years at a time.
The one caveat though, don't let your, God, I love the word dongle, Bluetooth dongle. Don't leave that in the bottom of your tray and let it get flooded. One of the best practices is, if you want to leave it in there, and what we actually have seen plenty of people do over the years, is leave one, or some guys will go buy 3 or 4 Soluses, and they'll install it in such a way that the little Bluetooth unit is either off the side of the bench, somewhere where it's not going to get wet, or they'll just unplug it and take it out and then just go plug it back in, take their reading, and then leave the room again. But actually leaving it in situ like that, if you can, is preferable, because that plant is growing around those prongs in the soil. And if you ever were in a situation where you had data loggers in place that are never moving, and you're trying to compare your quick spot measurements with your data logged measurements, you'll notice a little bit of difference between those two, even if you're stabbing the same pot.
Fantastic. Thank you, guys. Good luck at their grow plum. All right. Chuck dropped a couple questions. Chuck, I'm going to take one at a time. We got a lot of questions in, so I'm going to try to do my best to get as many from everybody as I can. So we're just going to start with this first one here. They want to know, for pH, are you supposed to up your input feed from 5.8 to 6.3 during flower in cocoa?
Sometimes I'll let it drift up a little bit towards the very end of the cycle. That being said, usually it's not a huge goal when it comes down to it. I mean, we're talking about, maybe 6 total, 6 at the high end at the very end of the cycle. So, you're talking, all right, well, let's start the cycle at 5.8 and at the end will be at 6. And really the only thing that's going on there is just trying to change a little bit of the nutrient solubility to encourage ripening.
Yeah, I've never seen a huge reason to do that. Part of what's affecting that pH change in the root zone is plants feeding or not feeding, and I can regulate that through strategic application of nutrient solution on there. I personally like to set whatever my feed pH input is, whether that's a 5.6, 5.8, 5.9, or a 6.0, and keep it right there, because then that's not a variable that I'm trying to figure out how it's impacting my root zone, especially, like I said, when we're looking at that ionic charge balance. It's tougher and we only have so many times that we can influence that, right? We're putting these small irrigations on throughout the day. We're not taking that pot, dunking it in the reservoir till it stops bubbling and just resetting it. So eliminating variables, I think, is best. Sometimes we'll drift that pH up a little bit to try to correct some low pH in the root zone, but not always recommended.
Yeah, and I think one of the themes that goes with a lot of what Seth and I recommend on the show, and I know it comes from a lot of the people that I've learned these things from that are masters in the industry as well, and that is, all right, what parts of this cycle can we simplify as best as possible, and which parts do we need some detail into to really optimize the plants? And so when we talk about, all right, we can actually do a feed EC, pretty much input feed EC the same over the entire cycle. And we can also do pH the same over the entire cycle. What we can't do is obviously the same irrigation schedules and durations over the entire cycle if we're trying to optimize these plants.
Fantastic, you guys. Thank you, Chuck, for that question. I'm going to do my best to get back to your second one, but let me get to some more visitor questions first. We got this question here. Can you keep LED grow lights height the same throughout the entire grow and just change power to achieve the correct PPFD?
Depends.
Yeah.
if your light's powerful enough, absolutely.
Yep. I mean, the best thing you can do is get a meter, start playing with different levels that you're taking that reading and different light strengths, see where you're actually getting to. It's the percentage on what PPFD a particular LED puts out at 60 versus 70 versus 80 versus 90 is not an industry standard constant. So really dialing that in for the light that you have is best. In my experience, I haven't been able to do that if I want to maintain optimum PPFD. But that's just my 2 cents with I think a 630 watt panel LED.
Yeah. And kind of just to go further on what Seth's talking about here with the, those percentages not being a standard in the industry, they're also not actually a percentage of PPFD that's coming out of the light. So most of the time, that 60%, 70% is actually talking about, an input power that the power supply is supplying to those diodes. Diodes have a little bit different efficiency at different power levels as well. And so, it's also important to put your lights at those levels and document what your PPFD looks like. So to put some numbers on it, let's say we've got a LED that's typically, 1,000 PPFD at 4 foot from the light or 5 foot from the light. The distance doesn't matter. Let's keep that constant here. But if I say, all right, let's turn that light down to 50%, that doesn't mean that it's at 500 PPFD. And that's going to be different from manufacturer to manufacturer. So make sure you go through and get that documentation down. And then really from there, it's just kind of simple. It's like, all right, well, we know what power we need to be at to hit that PPFD.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, the next thing to balance is how hard is it to move your lights? If we're looking at being as electrically efficient as possible, you're going to keep those lights close so you don't have that light loss over distance. if power is not a factor, or it's not going to be as much of an impactful factor at the scale you're at, and labor is going to cost more to move those lights up and down, well, there you've got your answer. That being said, a lot of the newer facilities out there that are coming online, especially as, over time, 5 years ago, we all wish we could get, 10 or 20 strains and grow those forever, right? And really nail them down and have ones that work in the facility. Now the game's changed. You need to be building out your grow to grow whatever, the market is demanding at that point in time. And as people approach this, we're looking at, some odd genetics out there, some that get really tall, some that don't get tall at all. So some of your investments in the future might be looking at systems like not light movers, but light hanging systems that I can go in and adjust that easily and quickly. Engineering for profitability in the future is something that should be in everyone's mind whenever we're looking at equipment inside of these facilities.
Yeah, wind systems for lighting, probably, with HPS stuff, I would say it's a really advantageous option. With a little bit better efficiency out of LEDs, I'd say, yeah, you're exactly right. For certain strain options, for certain building designs, it is a good way to go, but not necessarily as important as it would have been with, in HPS situations.
Absolutely. And when we look at some of the same light panels being used in double stack scenarios versus single stack or single plane growing, if I've only got 4 or 5 feet overhead from the top of my pot that I'm hitting the light right there, probably not as much of a concern as if I have, anywhere from 7 to 10 feet above the bench in which that light can occupy.
Wonderful. Thank you guys for that. All right, we got a couple minutes left. I'm going to ask this one question because I have an announcement at the end. This one came in from Julius. They wrote, if I'm feeding at 3.0 EC and coco from start to finish, how much runoff milliliters should I be aiming for to avoid nutrient lockout? What would you guys recommend?
Yeah, so kind of just my general rule of thumb is monitor my pH for making sure I'm not getting any nutrient lockout type of issues. And so that's not necessarily directly related to how much runoff that I want. So I always want to make sure that I'm avoiding nutrient lockout by making sure my pH out of runoff is good. And that being said, what I'm doing modulating runoff for is actually for keeping track of what EC levels I'm at. So typically during generative, you can take like Seth's strategy where you're not getting any runoff for a couple of days, but make sure you are getting it at least, every third day. I personally, I like to get at least a little bit enough runoff every day to get a pH measurement so that I am keeping that in check. And that being said, I've got some clients that are really well dialed in and they don't actually have any runoff. They're modulating their EC levels very well during that stacking period. And they've just got a keen enough ability. Oddly enough, some of those clients are nutrient manufacturers as well, but not for any specific names. But they're very familiar with how to avoid that type of lockout, and so they don't have to monitor it. But for, I would say 99% of the growers out there, making sure that runoff pH is in check, and then using runoff to modulate your EC. All right, so at a 3.0 EC, you're probably towards the lowest feeds that we see as commercially successful. Granted, all other variables are optimized in the facility, so good environment, CO2, plenty of light. And so, sometimes that makes it more difficult to stack. And you might not have the option to run enough runoff as you'd like to in that situation. And so you might end up saying, hey, maybe if I go to a 3.3 or a 3.4 in my grow cycle, I can get a little bit of runoff there, ensure that I'm not hitting lockout, and still have the stacking ability during the generative phases there at the beginning. And then obviously during vegetative, it kind of comes down to what do you see in the dynamics of those ECs? If we need to make sure that our ECs are pulled down lower, closer to our feed EC, then a little bit more runoff is going to do that for you. If you see that your ECs are dropping below your feed EC in bulking phases, then it's an absolute easy indicator that you're going to need to up your feed levels. Those feed EC levels need to supply more nutrients to the plant.
I think you touched on something really important there, Jason. And that's, for years and years and years, we always talk about lockout. And we all know that means the plant's not feeding. We've prevented it from doing that somehow, right? Most of the time in hydroponic situations, when we see nutrient lockout, it is generally that pH drifting down. Typically in practice, usually 5 to 10% of your irrigation volume as runoff is about what you want to shoot for as a rule of thumb, especially if you're not having any monitoring equipment. One thing I really love to do, and even if it's just a Solus, is try to get a root zone EC measurement off of the same plant that I'm taking that runoff sample off of. Because if I take a runoff sample off one plant and test one across the table, and that one just happens to have twice the amount of EC in it, the conclusions I draw from that aren't going to be very helpful, right? So basically looking at like, hey, I'm seeing my EC going up and my pH is fine. That's actually a trend we oftentimes see. If we're looking at time series data, one of the bigger trends we see is actually underfeeding. So feeding at a 3.0, but pushing either too much runoff or not feeding enough and not being able to stack above what the plant actually needs. So basically we're putting in that 3.0 every day, but even without runoff, that plant's pulling that EC down to, let's say, a 2.6 or a 2.5. And at that point, like we've talked, that low EC state, if I'm pulling 500 ppm out of 2000 or 500 out of 1500, that's going to be very impactful to my pH balance right there. So, the old drain to waste is basically, it's what we're all using these days. You're replacing what the plant put in. You're pushing out the things that it doesn't like. And if you really want to dial it, the only way to do it is going to be to get some pretty heavy sensor monitoring so you can really start to dial that in super precisely. And having the rest of the system, if I've got a 2,000 square foot room with 8 tables and 1 irrigation valve, I'm not going to be able to have the granularity to really dial that in. I'm going to have to go with a little more runoff just to make sure that all the plants are inside of an acceptable range. So that's probably one of the first places to start is how much control do you have? If it turns out a lot, if you have a valve for every 12 plants in your basement grow, sure, we can really start to dial that in. If we're running 100 or 200 plus plants on one valve, we've got to start talking about, okay, what's the best practice to make sure that all these plants are receiving somewhere between 2 and 10% runoff when we want it, and that all of them are being held inside of an acceptable EC and pH range.
Yeah.
Wow. Sorry, Jason, go ahead.
Oh, you're good. I was just going to say, sample sizes, obviously, if you've taken a statistics class, you know what you're familiar with the N number is. And then that's just basically the number that says, hey, I can attribute this population within a standard deviation if I have enough samples, right? And in most cases, getting that like statistically significant number of samples is not a financially viable option. And so we have to kind of think, let's make some assumptions in here about the consistencies in our grow room and say, all right, well, if I get 5 samples per 100 plants, that's enough for me to feel confident based on, what I'm seeing across this system.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to talk about too, in relation to like automatic irrigation. That's part of why it's really tough to actually have that work on a large plant population level without enough sensor density. So if I've got a room and 1 valve and 1 sensor, that's a pretty small sample size. It's really hard to draw good conclusions and make good choices. So I need a statistically significant representative of that population in order to decide what my actual ranges are. And that's part of why we've seen, a pretty slow progression when it comes to like AI irrigation, for instance, because hey, we can do a lot of computer modeling. We can do a lot of if and then programming. If you don't have enough sensors and valves for the program to actually work with, you're not going to have success on that front. So that's part of why we look at, that's part of why we're not as directly in controls. Our focus is on, getting that great data quality and being able to make these good choices, which is, hey, that's data, not direct control. Even though we do control the open sprinkler, it's something to think about long-term for your facility. And some of that doesn't just go back to soil sensors or substrate sensors or environmental sensors. Hey, if you're really invested in this, you might want to invest in some nice handheld environmental sensors too, to just be able to go redundantly check different things you have going on in your system. Anytime we're relying on technology, that technology can break. So we need to build our operations in a way that hopefully has some redundancy. That way we're, number one, covering our back if something does break. Number two, we always say you don't have good crop insurance in this game. So when something does break and you suffer some crop loss for it, it's a lot more penalizing than it can be in other businesses.
Yeah, Roy's got a YouTube video out there. I think it's called Sensor Density or Growth Behavior. It kind of just breaks some of this down with visuals on why it's important to take these considerations when growing at scale.
Way to end this episode on a high note, you guys. I think this is our longest episode ever, too. Look at us going a few minutes over. Thank you guys so much for all of this great information. Before we go, though, I want to let everybody know Office Hours Live is heading to Sacramento, California. We're collaborating with the Connect to bring crop steering and cultivation conversation live and direct to Sacktown. Guess who's going to be on the panel? Seth and Jason. Guess who's co-moderating with Sergio? Me. So the whole team is going to be there. Y'all should be there too. We're going to drop the RSVP link in the chat. It's a free event, but you got to RSVP. And if you're in the area, we would love to see you. We hope you can come out. But Seth and Jason, thank you so much for a great show. Shout out to Chris, the producer, for holding it down. Thank you so much for this great session. Thank you all for joining us for this week's AROYA Office Hours. To learn more about AROYA, book a demo at AROYA.io, and our team will show you the ins and outs of the ultimate cannabis cultivation platform. If you have crop steering or cultivation questions you want us to cover, drop them anytime in the AROYA app. Email us at sales@aroya.io or send us a DM via Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. We want to hear from you. And if we didn't get you to your question today, don't worry. We got you. We got a little bank. If you're a fan of the pod, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss an episode. We'll see you at the next session. Thanks, everybody.
I just got to say, Kaisha, if anyone plans on coming to those connected events, try to RSVP early. I know we don't organize it, but for Sergio's sake, it's really tough when you get a lot of demand just a few days before the event, because it's pretty tough to change that venue last minute. And they're really exciting. We love to see as many people there as possible. It's a good time.
That's a good point. Thank you, Seth. Yeah, we want as many people to come as possible. Sergio hosts amazing events. But yeah, definitely RSVP because they're popular. I'm dropping this in the chat here. We'll drop it on YouTube too. So we'll hopefully see y'all in Sacramento. Bye.